I love to tell the story for those who know it best seem hungering and thirsting to hear it like the rest. And when in scenes of glory I sing the new song, 'twill be the old story that I have loved so long. I love to tell the story, 'twill be my theme in glory, to tell the old story of Jesus and his love.
Who knows what evil leadership looks like? Anybody recognize this man? Idi Amin. Idi Amin. Ruler of what country? Uganda. Uganda back in the 70s. And he is responsible for the deaths of 500,000 Ugandans. We had a missionary from Uganda visit our church back when Idi was running strong. And he brought a native of Uganda along with him, and it was quite a revelation to hear firsthand what was going on in Uganda. But killing his own people, 500,000. This man, not quite as familiar to most people, Pol Pot, Cambodia, killed 2 million Cambodians, his own people, which was 25% of the population. 25% of his own people, he's responsible for their deaths. This man, everybody recognizes, this is a quite familiar face. 6 million Jews, 3 million Poles, 3 million Russians. This one? Stalin, Joseph Stalin. 40 million Russians. You see, if you're a certain kind of ruler, you don't like opposition, and you don't like people who will oppose you in any way whatsoever.
Gerald, didn't he starve a lot of his own people?
He did, through starvation, sending them to the gulags. Did it in many different ways. This one? Mao, Chairman Mao Zedong. 70 million Chinese. He was responsible for the deaths through starvation, through work camps, through whatever. 70 million of his own people. Not very nice people. But we're going to talk about evil leadership today, and I just thought we might start with some examples. These are all men who have ruled in my lifetime. Some of you who are younger might not be able to say that about some of these, but these are all people who have ruled since the Second World War. And we could come up with other names right now of living people who are ruling countries now who would be as evil as the people that we just looked at. And some may question whether you have some running for office who may be as evil as all that. What do people mean by an evil person? What do you think people mean when they say he is an evil person?
To me, living without God.
Living without God would be evil. People normally require a little stiffer standard than that overall, don't they? What else do they require of them, that they're not only living without God, but what else?
No conscience.
No conscience.
They bring evil to other people. I mean, they bring peril, death, or ruin or something to other people for their own benefit.
So they're willing to go to any extreme to accomplish whatever it is they want to accomplish.
No morals.
No morals. Immoral people. That's an important word to attach here as we look at the next few questions. If we're going to say that that's an immoral person who doesn't have any morals and doesn't have a conscience and is going to do whatever it is that he wants to do no matter what, that's what we're thinking of as an evil person. And that's generally what people are going to say is an evil person, isn't it? When you talk to most people, you're going to get an answer like that. If you ask them what is an evil person, they're going to give answers pretty much like what we've heard right here. Why are they frequently called insane? Have you noticed that? When you come up with somebody who is really evil, does horrible, horrible things, then there are a lot of people who are going to jump in and say, well, he's just insane. But why do people do that?
Different from them.
They are different, but why put the label of insane?
Gerald, I think one thing, it's kind of a way to cope with the fact that somebody could be that terrible.
It's a way of coping with the situation. How can there be such a person as that? And so if we think of them as being insane, then that kind of takes the pressure off. But it also is a way of removing responsibility, isn't it, for them? Have you noticed that when some people perform heinous acts of some sort, that some people are ready to jump in there and call them, well, they're insane. Well, if they were insane, then we remove them from responsibility, don't we? What about the politically correct people? I think you all have an idea as to what that means. But if you have these people who are generally politically correct, how do they view evil? Who would they consider to be an evil person?
Anyone who doesn't agree with them.
Okay. And to them, that's hateful, and so therefore evil in their eyes, isn't it? And they may not use the word, because if you're going to use the word evil, that implies immoral, and that implies that there is morality, there is a code, and they don't want that, do they?
The deplorable, I think.
Yes. The question that always comes up when you look at this stuff is, why would God allow an evil leader? Why would God allow an Idi Amin? Why would he allow a Pol Pot? Why would he allow a Hitler, a Stalin, a Mao? And you may think of some contemporaries of today that you might say, well, why would God allow such an evil person to be in a position of power?
That evil person is a reflection of the people at large. When he allows a person to come into leadership, that's kind of his judgment of them.
A couple things there. He is many times a reflection of the character of the nation, and sometimes he is brought as a judgment upon the people, isn't he? What effect does an evil leader have on the people who follow him?
Control.
Right? He is controlling. If you have a truly evil leader, like the ones that we mentioned, and you cross that person, what's going to happen to you?
Don't let the head of North Korea mad at you.
That's right. In fact, his picture is the one I had started with all this. I chose not to use someone who was living and active today, so I backed up to the ones who were born. Yes, family. Well, and that's not uncommon. Anybody who opposes such a person is definitely at risk of losing their life.
We have so many people, though, that will follow that evil brain will start thinking.
Yes, we'll see that in several instances where the evil leader has evil followers. I mean, those people who are going to fall into that way of thinking. I tilted this. I mean, it's sort of like leading them through twists and turns, but downward, right? Lower and lower. The people who follow the evil leader are just going to sink lower and lower and lower. Why must Christians be subject to evil leaders? For example, with Idi Amin in Uganda, there were Christians there. As I told you, the missionary came to our church, and he brought a Christian Ugandan with him, and they were going through all that. There were many Christians in Uganda. There are Christians in all those nations. Why would God have a Christian subject to an evil leader? You see, sometimes we start to think that kind of thing couldn't happen to us, right? I mean, we're good Christian people, and so therefore it really couldn't happen to me. I mean, we don't say that and we don't really think about it a whole lot, but there's that feeling, I think, inside of most of us, most of the time, that this really isn't a likely event. I mean, I can remember in a Sunday school class in this church 10 years ago when I was talking about how some things were happening and what might happen coming down the road, and I had a senior member of the church say that will never happen here, and some of the things we talked about have already happened. We all get that feeling once in a while that this isn't going to happen to us. Why are we talking about this?
I think we're subject to it sometimes so we can see the power of God. Just think of Corrie ten Boom and what she was able to come back with. There are many Christians who have told about how God intervened, and it gives you hope.
So he's going to work in lots of situations, isn't he? Some of them are going to be pleasant, some of them are not going to be pleasant, but we're going to still see his hand at work.
Evil regime, sometimes that the dross of Christians is removed and they become a stronger Christian. Or a person who's not a Christian might become a Christian because of the evil.
So lots of good things can happen from it. Won't be pleasant, though, will it? If there is an evil leader, it's going to be a very unpleasant situation. I use the word subject to here, and I'm glad you all stayed right on that subject. being subject to, you have no control of that whatsoever, do you? Or virtually none. Basically, you have no control over this. It's just there they are the rulers, and you are subject to them. But what can we expect if we are under this evil ruler? An evil nation under an evil leader. What can you expect? It's not going to be pleasant at all. It's going to be very, very unpleasant. Persecution can easily lead to death. I mean, if you had a Muslim, true Muslim, following Muhammad and the Quran and the Sirah, and you're under that rule as a Christian, at some point you're going to be given the option, aren't you? Are you going to convert or die? There's your choice. What can a Christian do in an evil nation with an evil leader?
Paul said, pray for your leaders.
Pray for your leaders.
You know, sometimes those leaders are like with Daniel, because of his testimony, he found favor.
So, like Daniel, or as we're told in general, to let our light shine, even at the threat of death.
Well, when Paul was talking in Romans 13 about submitting to the government, it was probably at that time.
So we are not to stop being who we are. It won't be easy, it won't be pleasant, and your life may be in danger, but that's what you need to do. When everything's going really well, that's when we think we're much better and much stronger and much smarter than we really are. Because when things are going really well, we have a tendency to think we're really good. Look at what I have done. Film clip for you this morning is from a documentary. Ben Stein put this out in 2008, and I know some of you have seen it, Expelled. And in this documentary, he deals with academia around the world, actually, but focusing on the United States, in dealing with intelligent design versus evolution, creationism versus evolution. He handles this and how the academic community has shut off debate. We hear that on lots of topics, don't we? You know, it's settled science, so we don't need to talk about it anymore. Don't need to discuss it, it's settled. He deals with that and how academia has shut off discussion about Darwinism and evolution. And he goes back to a lot of different things, but he deals with Darwinism and Hitler. So we're going to go back to the Second World War and the influence that Darwinism had upon Hitler. And you may say, well, why are we looking at that? Well, Hitler was one of our evil leaders that we looked at in the beginning. Certainly an immoral leader, although many people will say, well, he was a Christian, so there's just Christians at work. Nonsense. There's nothing Christian about what Hitler was doing. Anybody can put a label on themselves. I can stand here and say I'm a Muslim all I want to. It doesn't make me a Muslim. Or I can stand here and say I'm a Christian all I want to, and that doesn't make me a Christian. It's going to go back to that. And what we're going to see is there's a picture of also as to where we are right now. And while it's dealing with a very specific issue about evolution and creationism, it also, at the very end, will point out a couple of topics where this is applicable today in euthanasia and abortion. And I'm going to suggest to you that's also useful to us today in the topic of evil leadership in general and how that may impact us today. So it's a clip that is a little different from what you've been seeing, but I think it will be instructive.
So what is this place?
During the Second World War, 15,000 people were killed here.
Why were they killed?
They were killed because they were people with handicaps.
Why kill them? What's the point of killing them?
People who were not able to work, people who were not able to live by themselves, that they were useless eaters.
Useless eaters.
And life unworthy of living.
So what is this?
This is the dissection table.
Do you ever think to yourself, the sane ones were the ones lying here having their brains removed? The insane one was Dr. Gorgas and all the other people did?
No, I don't think that, because I think those people who killed here, they were very sane, because they had their purposes.
They had purposes?
Yes.
When it was a fully functioning concentration camp, and what was the purpose of it? I mean, part of it was to repress political enemies. What was the rest of the purpose?
Well, beyond the repression of the political enemies, which was its purpose at the very beginning, then later on it transformed into repressing racial enemies. And sometimes those categories overlapped, because sometimes they thought that these people were political enemies because they were inferior biologically.
Would you say that Hitler was insane?
No, I wouldn't say he was insane. I think he had imbibed some very, very wrong ideas. And in fact, I think he took the logic of them in certain ways that brought him to take very radical solutions for them.
Would you say he was evil?
Oh, I'd definitely say he was evil.
And evil can sometimes be rationalized as science.
Oh, sure. And evil can sometimes be rational. When it's rationalized as science, and I think when it's rationalized in this particular way in particular, I think Hitler thought he was doing good.
He thought he was doing good?
Oh, I think so. He thought he was benefiting. He thought he was benefiting humanity by driving evolution forward and creating a better humanity.
But if Darwinism inspired and justified such horrific events in the past, could it be used to rationalize similar initiatives today?
There's a good German expression, so fängt es immer ein. I mean, it always begins in the same way. Something to remember in the context of United States discussions of euthanasia and abortion. It always begins in the same way. There seems to be an excellent argument for getting rid of useless people by killing them. Or at least it seems excellent to the people advancing the argument.
Love affair with death, and the euthanasia and this movement going on, which I find appalling. And the idea is that immediately rid our society of anybody who might be a drain, and think of people in economic terms. And I think that's where some of the Darwin fits in.
There are several points here, and we could talk the rest of the time just about what we've seen right here. One thing I wanted to mention was about 10 or 12 years ago, before Obamacare, with discussions that were going on in this country about health care before Congress, experts were being brought in to argue how to handle the health care problem in the United States. There was a very serious argument presented and argued for by a lot of people that we should stop spending so much money in this country on the medical care of people over the age of 65. And we need to take that money and assign it to our youth. The majority of the money that we spend on the health care of people over 65 needs to be applied to education and whatever we can do for the youth of America. But the other point in here is political enemies. They brought in here that this Hitler was dealing with political enemies. Have you ever heard anybody talk in this country about their political enemies? Well, when you get to a certain point in the degradation of the morals of a country, then the way you deal with a political enemy is a little different than the way you have been accustomed to dealing with political enemies in this country. How far away are we from a harsher way of dealing with political enemies? And like the professor said, it all begins in the same way. And we've already begun our path in this country toward this same kind of thing. Let's go to our stories. I want to remind you, for those of you who were here, we talked about Josiah, who was a good king for an evil nation. He was a king for the southern kingdom of Judah after the kingdom split. Northern kingdom had already gone into captivity. And Israel had had a whole bunch of kings. By the time we get to Josiah, he was probably the best man to be king of Israel, including Solomon, including David. I mean, he was a good man, but the nation was evil. So God can bring that good person in just to convict the evil nation even more. When they wouldn't follow carefully and stay with what this good man was doing, they did not deserve him, and they were punished accordingly, because it was only a few years before the whole nation was taken into captivity into Babylon. The whole thing fell apart shortly after they couldn't follow the good king. Today we're going to talk about Abimelech. Now, this is an evil leader for an evil people. We're going to have today an evil leader with an evil nation. If you're a Christian living in that environment, this is the most unpleasant you can imagine. The story is really in Judges 9, but the little history in Judges 8 is important. We start with Gideon. Gideon is Abimelech's father. Gideon was a judge. The Midianites were disturbing the people in Israel, and so God called Gideon to be a judge and solve this problem. Now, this is what Judges is all about. Remember, the people come into the land from Egypt. They march up through the wilderness for over 40 years and then cross the Jordan River into the Promised Land. And for the next 360 years, they're in the land, but they don't have a king. God is their king. God rules, and if they get into trouble, God calls somebody to lead them through the trouble. And that's what the judges were for, to lead them through the difficulty. Gideon was one of those people. He was successful in doing that. The Midians came in. He drove them out. Then the people of Israel said, well, Gideon, we want you to be our king. And Gideon said no. So Gideon now has a pretty good life going for himself with the Midianites out and everybody adoring him the way. So he has a lot of wives and he has 70 sons. Didn't say he was a perfect man. We just said he did the job that God called him to do. In addition, he had a concubine in Shechem. Gideon was an Oprah, but he had a concubine in Shechem. But he also then had a son by this concubine in Shechem. That son's name is Abimelech. Abimelech is a son of Gideon by a concubine, not a wife, just a good, steady girlfriend. So we meet Abimelech. There's one more thing you need to understand. When Gideon died, well, I'll use the words that the writer in Judges said. The people of Israel turned again and whored after the Baals. That's strong language, because this is a serious business. The people of Israel went after the Baals, the gods of the Canaanites. There are several of those. When they talk about the Baals, you kind of lump them all together. But one of them was Moloch, which was the god to whom they sacrificed children. They whored after the Baals, the gods of the Canaanites, and you need to remember that this includes child sacrifice. So what's your opinion of the people of Israel at this time? They're doing what God warned them about before they came into the land. And when he sent them into the land, he said, kill everybody in there because you don't want to fall into the same mess that they're in, worshiping their gods and doing all the evil stuff that they do. Well, they didn't run everybody out. The people are still around them, and they're worshiping their gods, and they're doing the evil things that they did. So, evil nation, right from the get-go. As soon as Gideon died, they fell right into it. Now, Gideon's out of the way now. We don't have to listen to that. We'll just do what we want to do. Well, isn't that what Judges is all about? A time when every man did what was right in his own eyes. That's what's happening here. They're doing what is right in their own eyes. So now let's talk about Abimelech. Once Gideon's dead, Abimelech's mother is in Shechem. Gideon is from Oprah, way up near the Sea of Galilee. There's not that much distance here. I mean, it's from Jerusalem up to Oprah, I think it's 60 miles? Abimelech's the son of Jerubbaal. Wait a minute. Jerubbaal? I thought it was Gideon. Well, that is Gideon. This is the other name that Gideon has. What it means is one who fights against Baal. So Gideon was one who opposed Baal, contended with Baal. The people are going the other way, and we're going to see now where Abimelech goes. So Abimelech, son of Gideon, goes to Shechem, and he tells his relatives, you go to the rulers and say to them, which is better, to have all these sons of Gideon ruling over you, or should there be one person ruling over you? So he says, let's have one. And remember that I am bone of your bone and flesh of your flesh. I'm one of you. I am the son of a Shechemite woman. So which son do you think you guys ought to pick? Have you heard that kind of argument before? Well, you should vote for me because I'm the same race you are. Or you should vote for me because I'm the same gender you are. You should vote for me because I have the same background that you have. Or I went to the same school that you went to. Or I have the same color eyes that you have. All of those are stupid things to say. But how much do those things influence how people act? They are very influential things. Abimelech says, go to the leaders and say, look, you've got a chance to have a son of Gideon ruling over you and somebody who was related to you, one of your area. So they say, okay, we're going to support him. And then they go to the temple, Baal-berith. Baal is Baal, of course, god of the Canaanites. Berith is of the covenant. So apparently they made a covenant with Baal like God made a covenant with the people of Israel. Now, that isn't a very good thing for them to do, but apparently they made a covenant with Baal. And so they go into the house of this god that they have created, and they take some silver from the house of that god. And they're going to give it to Abimelech. So they're providing financial support for Abimelech as well. And it's interesting that it comes from the house of Baal. They go into the temple to this foreign god and bring out money and give that to Abimelech. That's where the support's coming from. So he goes out and he hires a bunch of people to go around with him. Now, you have to have a good little army around you if you're going to be a good leader. You can't be out there walking alone. You have to have your bodyguards and all the henchmen around you, thugs. Well, the first order of business is to kill your brothers. So that's what he does. He goes back to Ophrah and kills his brothers on a single stone. That's a representation of him sitting on the stone where he's just killed his brothers. Is he the kind of person you would like to have as your leader? And if you are trying to live under his rule, probably you're going to want to try to please him as much as you can, because you know what he did to his brothers. And he would not hesitate to do it to you if he feels that you're crossing him in any way whatsoever. However, one brother escapes, Jotham, the youngest. Managed to hide himself. You know, if there are 70 of them, if you only kill 69, I mean, who really notices? They're all the brothers out of the way. It's the only thing left to do is to make him a king. So Abimelech is made king. They go out to the oaks by the pillar in Shechem and they make him king. So Abimelech is now the king, at least of Shechem and whatever other territory that he can manage to hold on to. Jotham hears that he's made king and he comes to Mount Gerizim. Now Mount Gerizim and Mount Zalman, or Mount Ebal, I use Zalman here because that's going to come up in the story. These little mountains or hills shelter Shechem. Shechem sits down here in the valley between those two mountains. So Jotham stands up on Mount Gerizim and hollers down at the people in Shechem. See, when you first read that, you may think, well, he's crying down from a mountain to the people in the city? How are they going to hear him? Standing up here and yelling to the people down here is not a problem, especially with the acoustic of the valley between the two hills. So he stands up there and he shouts down and he says, okay, listen to me, I'm going to tell you a story. The trees tried to get another tree, an olive tree, to be their king. Now you say, that's really kind of stupid, isn't it? For the trees to have a king tree? Does it make any more sense for these people of Israel to have a king? It is stupid for the trees to be asking for a tree to be king over them, but it's just as stupid for the people of Israel to be asking for a king, because God's been with them for 260 years from the time they've come into the land till the time you get to Abimelech, and they've not needed a king in there, and they've had judges to help them deal with any difficult problems. But now they've made themselves a king. So he tells a story. He says, oh, look, the trees are asking another tree to be the king. And the olive tree says, no, I can't do it. I'm producing all this fruit. I'm not going to give that up. They ask a fig tree. Fig tree says, nope, not going to do it. Producing all these figs, all this wonderful fruit, not going to do it. They ask a grapevine to be their king. Grapevine says, nope, not going to do it. Making the stuff for wine. So then a bramble bush, which is a useless bush, good for the fire only, to be the king. And the bramble bush says, okay, if you're serious, I'll be your king. If you're not serious, I'll burn you with fire out of the bramble. He proceeds to explain what all that means. He says, if you're really sincere about having Abimelech for your king, have at it. But if you're not, what's going to happen is fire is going to come and consume you, and you're going to consume Abimelech. Interesting little story. What it shows us is God is still here. God has a plan for how this is going to work. We have an evil nation with an evil leader. God is still here. God is still sovereign. God is still in control. It's an unpleasant, ugly, nasty situation, but God is still there. So Abimelech ruled over Israel 3 years, and God sent an evil spirit then between the leaders of Shechem and Abimelech. God says, okay, after 3 years of this nonsense, it's time to put a plan into motion. So he sends an evil spirit between them, and so there's this bickering that goes on, and the leaders take some action like putting robbers along the highway and doing things, but making Abimelech look bad. So there is this going on, and then a man comes into Shechem by the name, and the man's name is Gaal. Gaal and his family come into Shechem, and he's a troublemaker, a bad guy. So you have an evil man who's trying to usurp the power of an evil king over an evil nation. So it kind of looks like the evil is just getting worse. But it's setting things in motion. So Gaal comes in and he says, if everybody would just be under my control, then I'd take care of this evil Abimelech. I'd get that jerk and run him out of town. I'd solve your problem for you. in Shechem. Abimelech is king over everything, so he has his own man in Shechem as, I don't know if he's the mayor or whatever, but he's a leader in there. Zabel hears what's going on with Gael, and he sends word out to Abimelech, says, look, we've got a revolution started here, and you better do something about it. So Abimelech rose up at night and went in. As Gael came out, they attacked him and drove everybody back and whipped him. So they had this victory, but that really wasn't decisive. And overnight, Abimelech had time to think about it. So the next morning, goes back and he captures the city. He destroys the city, burns the city, kills everybody in the city, sows salt in the city. So that's Shechem today, down to the ground. That's what he did to Shechem. Killed everybody in the city. Now, that's what you would expect an evil leader to do, right? You have the opposition, you squash it. Kill them all. In most cities, they would build a tower, sort of a safe place within the safe place. You have a walled city, that's supposed to be safe. Then you build a tower inside that, so if anybody gets inside, you can get up in the tower and shoot arrows down and kill them. Well, in this case, Shechem there was a tower of Shechem, but it apparently was outside the city of Shechem. Shechem is destroyed. A bunch of the leaders of Shechem have gone to the tower of Shechem and holed up in there. Abimelech goes up on Mount Zabal, gets some bramble bushes, puts them around the base of the tower, sets them on fire, burns the tower and the 1,000 women and men who are inside the tower, and I would assume children as well. Kills another 1,000 people, destroys the city by fire. Well, this sounds a little bit like what Jotham was saying. The bramble will consume you. Well, now Abimelech's on a high. He's had this great success. So he decides to go up to Thebez, just a few miles up, and say, I'm going to take that city too. They haven't really been following me the way that I think they should. So I'm going to go up there and take that city. So he camped against it and he captured the city. But in this city, the tower was on the inside. So there was a strong tower within the city, and all the men and women, the leaders, went up in the tower. Hey, it worked before, so we're going to get some bramble bushes. We're going to put them around the bottom. We're going to set the tower on fire. We're going to consume the tower and the people and kill them all off. However, he came to the tower to light it, and some woman up on the top of the tower takes a millstone and drops it and hits Abimelech in the head and kills him. Writer to Judges says, thus God returned the evil of Abimelech, which he committed against killing his brothers. He paid the price for what he did. Also, he points out that the people, the leaders of Shechem, all died in this process, and so they paid the price for helping him do what he wanted to do. So the evil's repaid. Summarize this. One of the key points here is it's really all about rejecting God's leadership. This is where we get into trouble with the evil leaders. Yeah, we're going to have good leaders, we're going to have bad leaders, but where we get into trouble is when we ourselves reject God's leadership for us and we fall for that evil leader. And in 1 Samuel, when Saul was about to be made the first king, 100 years after Abimelech, when Israel finally gets a real king, Saul. See, Israel only had 3 kings for the whole nation. Saul, David, and Solomon. Others just had pieces. But they come to Samuel, the prophet, and say, okay, we want you to make a king over us. And of course that upsets Samuel. But God says to Samuel, they're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. This request for a king was a rejection of God's leadership. So for us, it's like everything else. When all these things are happening, it's not what is God doing. God's going to do what God's going to do. But what does he want me to do now? What does he want me to do in this situation? See, when we're unsatisfied with what God is doing, the natural thing for man is to figure out how to fix it for him. The natural thing is to seek a human remedy, and that's stupid. Use a stronger word. It's stupid. God is sovereign in all situations. Our task is to do what he wants us to do in that situation. And while we may avoid judgment by man by doing something, you'll never avoid the judgment of God.
I love to tell the story, 'twill be my theme in glory, to tell the old story of Jesus and his love.